Good afternoon, and welcome to the Jewish Policy Center webinar. I am Shoshana Bryan, Senior Director of the JPC and your host. After weeks and months of looking abroad for both good news and bad, and finding mostly bad, we are going domestic today. We're going to look at our own government and its strengths and weaknesses, mostly its strengths, and the work of the Founding Fathers. Before I introduce our guest, constitutional scholar Roger Pilon, I'm going to introduce the JPC and our work. We are a 501c3 organization founded in 1985, providing perspectives and analysis of foreign and domestic policies by leading scholars and commentators. JPC supports a strong American defense capability, U.S.-Israel security relations, missile defense, and not watching the Chinese Olympics. We support the legitimacy and security of Israel against anyone who would deny them. The JPC sits slightly to the right of center, and we advocate for small government, low taxes, free trade, fiscal responsibility, energy security, free speech, and intellectual diversity. Those last two being really important these days. You can read our publications, Insight, the In Context blog, Alliance Tracker, and Frontline Defense on our website at jewishpolicycenter.org. That's jewishpolicycenter.org. And speaking of inFOCUS Quarterly, our guest, Roger Pilon, has written for us 4 times in the last couple of years, always about what our government is, what it should be, and how to get closer to the vision the Founding Fathers laid out for us. It is a remarkable series of articles. I strongly encourage you, if you didn't see them when they came out, to go to our website and download them. They are terrific. Roger Pilon joined the Cato Institute as a senior fellow in October of 1988, and he holds the Institute's Kenneth Simon Chair in Constitutional Studies. He also served as, as Vice President for Legal Affairs and publisher of Cato's Supreme Court Review, which he founded in 2001. Prior to Cato, Roger held 5 senior posts in the Reagan administration, including in the Office of Personnel Management, the Department of State, and the Department of Justice. He has been a national fellow at Stanford's Hoover Institution. He lectures and debates at universities and law schools across the country and abroad, and he testifies often before Congress. Roger has been awarded Columbia University's School of General Studies Alumni Medal of Distinction, and I love this one. In 1989, the Bicentennial Commission presented him with its Benjamin Franklin Award for Excellence in Writing on the U.S. Constitution. Again, go to inFOCUS and read Roger Pilon on the Constitution, on the Supreme Court. It was a very well-deserved honor. His writings have appeared in the legacy press, in every outlet you can imagine, all of the legal and professional press you can imagine, and all of the television and radio outlets you can imagine. Name one, and I'll verify it for you. Roger Pilon holds a BA from Columbia University, an MA and a Ph.D. from the University of Chicago, and a JD from the George Washington University School of Law. And now, Roger Pilon, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Shoshana, and it's a joy to be with you here in this webinar, which we've titled The Constitutional Roots of a Divided America. It hardly needs saying that America is deeply divided. So let me start by summarizing my thesis, which is that of all the grounds on which we're divided today, as a nation, none is more fundamental than our disagreement about the proper role of government under our Constitution. Now, you might think we'd settled that more than 200 years ago when we ratified the Constitution to establish a more perfect union. And we did so again after the Civil War when we corrected fundamental flaws in the original design. But toward the end of the 19th century, with the rise of progressivism and the ever latent populism, we saw a fundamental shift in the climate of ideas in America. And the progressives essentially rejected the founders' understanding of liberty under limited constitutional government. They were social engineers. They saw government as an institution through which to do all manner of good. They were concerned, unlike the founders who were, and subsequent generations, who were concerned mainly about what government can do to us. The progressives sought to see what government could do for us. As I said, they were social engineers, drawing from European models, coming from the elite universities of the Northeast. The courts during the early decades of the 20th century rejected much of their agenda as being inconsistent with the Constitution. But with the rise of the New Deal and the fundamental effort of Franklin Roosevelt to pack the Supreme Court with 6 new members after the landslide election of 1936, the court essentially deferred to the political branches, and that gave rise to the modern regulatory and redistributive state that we know and love so much today. Today, the state controls vast areas of our lives where we were originally meant to live most of our life in the private sector. Today, the public sector dominates so much. But it isn't simply the rejection of freedom to plan and live our own lives that's of concern here. There are vast practical problems as well. The demand for ever more goods and services that so many people are making today has led to a situation whereby we are unable or unwilling to pay for those goods and services. So we borrow. And so today we are looking at a federal debt approaching 30 trillion, that's with a T, $30 trillion, and growing, and no one knows how to come to grips with that, with the vast entitlement programs like Social Security, and especially even sooner, Medicare, coming to an end of the so-called trust funds. We're talking about just a few years down the road with these. And we are now faced, as we learned just this morning, that the inflation is at 7.5%. That means that ever more of our tax dollars are going to go into servicing the debt. This cannot go on. This will not end well unless we come to grips with it. And then finally, I could say that as a social matter, the politicization of everything has produced a culture where even free speech, due process, and epistemic objectivity are under assault in today's cancel culture with the politicization of everything. And so all this comes down in the end to the question about what the proper role of government is under our Constitution. A question, presumably, as I said, that we ratified that we settled when we ratified the Constitution. But the New Deal Court, under the pressure of Franklin Roosevelt and company, effectively rejected that understanding that we have for our first 150 years. But don't take my word for this. Here's Rexford Tugwell, one of the principal architects of the New Deal, writing some 30 years later, reflecting on his work. He was a Columbia professor and he was at the head of the Brain Trust. He said, in order to get our programs through, we had to engage in tortured interpretations of a document that was intended to prevent them. Think about that. They knew exactly what they were doing. They were ignoring the Constitution of limited government in order to institute their New Deal programs. And so that's the legacy that we're living with. And we see it borne out whenever there are hearings before the Senate Judiciary Committee for members of the Supreme Court. And we saw that in the last three nomination sessions. You have on one side people demanding ever more government and condemning those who oppose that. And then the other side, people saying, look, the Constitution does not authorize this. And so that's the thesis that I want to develop in just a little more detail. Those of you who want to see it in greater detail, as Shoshana said, go to the pieces that appear in inFOCUS, or go to my website, my bio page at the Cato Institute, and you'll see loads of articles there that go into detail about this. So let's do that. And I'm going to, again, only summarize this thesis, but with a little more than I've said so far. And we have to start not with the Constitution, but with the Declaration of Independence, with our birth certificate, because that's where the founders set forth their vision of liberty under limited constitutional government. And you look at that first paragraph and you see that Jefferson, its principal author, placed us in the natural law tradition, the tradition that holds that there's a higher law of right and wrong from which to derive the actual or positive law, and against which to criticize that law at any point in time. There was nothing extraordinary about that idea. It goes all the way back to antiquity. It stands for the idea that there is a higher law of right and wrong from which to derive the actual or positive law, and against which to criticize it at any point in time. And we see that in the famous second paragraph that begins, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." So notice they were talking about these propositions that follow as truths, self-evident truths, truths of reason. So we shouldn't put a religious cast to that in any strong sense. These were ideas that were appropriate for moral and political relationships that apply to all people at all times in all circumstances. And you look at those principles and you see they start with a premise of moral equality defined by rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Obviously, they didn't mean that we're equal in all respects. They meant equal only with reference to having equal natural rights. And in this notion of a right to pursue happiness, you have a fundamental distinction that is crucial to grasp if you're going to understand the mindset of the founders, namely that what makes you happy isn't necessarily what makes me happy. There is a distinction between values and rights, subjective values and objective rights. Each of us has an objective right to pursue happiness by his own subjective values as he works his way through life, provided he respects the equal rights of others to do the same. In this, you see that they were standing in the long tradition of state of nature theory, which goes back to the Romans and Seneca in particular, as was later developed in greater detail by Hobbes and especially by John Locke, the philosophical founder of the American Revolution. And in this, this distinction between rights and values, we've got a way to draw a contrast between two schools of moral epistemology that we've inherited from antiquity: moral skepticism and moral dogmatism. Moral skepticism holds that there are no moral truths, or if there are, we can't know them. Dogmatism holds that there are moral truths pertaining to every aspect of the human condition: what you can eat, what you can smoke, what you can, the sexual practices you can engage in, the role of women in society. Think of some of the draconian codes in various places around the world today. When you draw this distinction between rights and values, you then are able to chart a course between these two unattractive epistemological alternatives. You have morality on one hand, with respect to our rights, as against the moral skeptic. But you also have liberty on the other hand, as against the moral dogmatist, as to how you can exercise those rights. And so you now have a vision, a moral vision, which you can then find the legal arrangements to secure. And the framers drew mostly from the Anglo-American common law to carry that out. So we get to the next part of the Declaration, and we see that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So notice, government is twice limited. It's limited by its ends to secure our rights and by its means, which must be consented to. Unfortunately, that consent requirement can never really be deeply satisfied. The most we can do is come up with a kind of majoritarianism or supermajoritarianism when we get to constitutions. But the fact that you will always have dissenters means that an implication of that problem is that one wants to do as little as necessary through government, where it will be done in violation of the interests and sometimes the rights of those who oppose doing it. And as much as possible in the private sector, where it can be done voluntarily and hence in violation of the rights of no one. So you get from this little exercise the idea that government is a necessary evil, as the founders understood it. It is to be turned to not as a first resort, as so many progressives do today, but rather as a last resort when the private sector cannot address an issue. And that brings us to the issue of public goods, goods that would not be secured but for the presence of government. Chief among those are such things as national defense, clean air and water, law enforcement, and the like. But once you go beyond those carefully defined public goods, as economists define them, then you're in the realm of private goods, everything from healthcare to education to retirement security to you name it, all of which should be ideally conducted in the private sector where it can be done freely and in violation of the rights of no one. And so what emerges from the Declaration is this vision of live and let live. Each of us free to plan and live his life as he wishes, as he works his way through life, provided he respects the equal rights of others. And when you get to the Constitution, you see in the preamble, we're right back in state of nature theory. The preamble reads that we the people, for the purposes listed, do ordain and establish this government. In other words, all power starts with the people. They give the government whatever powers they give it. The government does not give us our rights. We're born with our rights, natural rights. And so the purpose of government is to secure those rights and do the few other things that we have authorized it to do. Now, when we look at the body of the Constitution itself, we see that vision carried out. There is the division of powers between the federal and state governments, with most power left with the states. There's the separation of power between the three branches, each defined functionally. There's the bicameral legislature, each chamber constituted differently, federalism. There is the provision for unitary executive with the power to veto legislation and the power of Congress to override the veto by a supermajority. There's the provision for unitary, or rather for a independent judiciary to check the political branches and later the states to see that they conform to the strictures set forth in the document. And there is the provision for periodic elections, not to enlarge the government, but to fill the offices set forth in the document. Finally, though, there is the provision for the most important provision to limit government, namely the doctrine of enumerated powers. We gave government, Congress, only certain legislative powers, 18 in particular. You look at Article 1, Section 8, and you see them enumerated. And finally, when you get to the last evidence from the founding period, the 9th and 10th Amendments to the Bill of Rights, which was added later, you see the Declaration recapitulated all over again. The Ninth Amendment makes it clear that we have rights, both enumerated and unenumerated. The 10th Amendment makes it clear that the federal government has only those powers we have granted it. If you don't find it there, it either belongs to the states or to the people never having been given to either level of government. So again, the vision is one of liberty under limited constitutional government. And we lived under that for roughly 150 years. It wasn't perfect, to be sure. The framers made their Faustian bargain with slavery. They knew it was inconsistent with their founding principles. They hoped it would wither away in time. It did not. It took a civil war and the passage of the Civil War amendments to correct the original sin of the oblique recognition of slavery in the original Constitution. So now we come to the progressive era, when there was a fundamental shift in the climate of ideas. As I said earlier, the progressives rejected the Constitution of the founders. Wilson, for example, saw the Constitution as a straitjacket. He would have much preferred a parliamentary system, which gave the executive branch much more power. That's not the system we have. And so when they sought to implement their programs, mostly at the state level in the early decades of the 20th century, the court stood athwart to that to a substantial degree, not entirely for sure, but to a substantial degree. But things came to a head during the New Deal when the court found a number of Roosevelt's programs during his first term to be unconstitutional, either because there was no power for them under the doctrine of enumerated powers, or because they violated rights that were held by the people, both enumerated and unenumerated. Well, after the landslide election of 1936, when all but 2 states went for Roosevelt, Roosevelt unveiled in early 1937 his infamous threat to pack the Supreme Court with 6 new members. There was uproar in the country over that. Not even the Democratic Congress, the House was 4-1 Democrat, would go along with it. Nevertheless, the court got the message. There was the famous switch in time that saved 9, and it began rewriting the Constitution without benefit of constitutional amendment. And it did it in 3 main steps, which I'm simply going to mention here because there isn't time for much more. First of all, in 1937, the court eviscerated the doctrine of enumerated powers, the fundamental principle for limited government. It did that with respect to 2 clauses, the so-called General Welfare Clause, which opened the floodgates to the modern redistributive state, and the Commerce Clause, which opened the floodgates to the modern regulatory state. So with those floodgates opened, the government began legislating and instituting ever more programs. However, you could still invoke your rights. So to address that problem, in 1938, the court distinguished 2 kinds of rights, fundamental and non-fundamental, and 2 levels of judicial review. If a law implicated a fundamental right like speech, voting, and other later on certain personal liberties, the court would apply strict scrutiny. The means must be narrowly tailored, and the statute would doubtless be found unconstitutional. If it implicated non-fundamental rights, the court would apply the so-called rational basis test. In other words, if there was some rationale for the statute, if you could imagine some reason for it, that was good enough. And so with respect to economic liberty, property rights, the rights we exercise in ordinary commercial relations, well, all those statutes poured through. Now, the court was essentially deferential to the political branches during this period. But in the 50s, it's got its second wind, and not a moment too soon with such things as the civil rights of people and, of course, certain criminal procedural rights. But that established 2 approaches to the Constitution, namely by the court, judicial restraint among conservatives, judicial activism among liberals, neither reflected the actual Constitution. It remained, for those of us who were starting in the 1970s, very few of us, to call for a return to the Madisonian Constitution of limited government as corrected by the Civil War amendments. And I'm happy to say that that is a school of thought that stands between those two liberal and conservative alternatives that is today coming to be ever more present on the Supreme Court as it wrestles with the problem of the modern administrative executive state, where most of the law is created today under which we live, not by Congress, but all these 400 and more executive branch agencies that are all over the city of Washington. And so we have come to the state of affairs where this ubiquitous government is regulating and redistributing and controlling so much of our private lives. And it is leading to the politicization of everything. The question then we're left with is, how do we get out of that? Ultimately, the issue is cultural. We have to come to an understanding that government is not the answer to our every problem. We lived in our first 150 years mostly in the private sector. We should return to that, because when we throw things into the public sector, it is a constant battle over conflicting values that are carried out. Do we need any better indication today than what's going on in our public schools across the country with critical race theory, with transgender indoctrinations, with one program after another that pits parents against parents, parents against school boards? We need to move to address that problem with the privatization of education so that people can make choices as to where they will send their children and take it out of the public domain, where the battles are absolutely predictable and are taking place in our very eyes today. Shoshana, let me stop right there and then invite the questions of your audience.
Roger, thank you. I'm going to admit that I'm old. And when I went to school, a lot of people talked about the things that you just talked about today. Are those things no longer taught in school? Because it doesn't sound like they come out in our public discourse today. Have we given up civics in school? Have we stopped teaching kids the things that they need to know to do this?
Shoshana, I am older than you. And I remember that my sixth grade teacher, who was 70 years old, I grew up in upstate New York, rural upstate New York. We had in sixth grade world history, a large text, and we worked our way through that by February. And what do you suppose we did for the rest of the year? We went back to page 1 and went through the book all over again. We used to teach history. Then we started teaching social studies. And now today we teach, the kinds of things that we hear about, namely diversity politics, diversity, inclusion, and all the contemporary woke issues. And the result is that we are pitting people against people. When you make little white kids feel guilty about what people did 200 years ago, you are inviting dissension and division, and we see it all over the place today. All you need, if you're on Twitter, you know what's going on.
Maybe one shouldn't be on Twitter. You mentioned, I've got questions now from people who've been listening. Mm-hmm. You've mentioned that Congress is not legislating in all cases, but that in fact, agencies of government make rules and then people sue, and then you get through the courts as to whether that thing was okay. How can we restore the legislative function of the House and the Senate so the courts don't end up, in effect, writing our laws? What's the way back?
Yeah, well, the beginning is something that I hadn't mentioned earlier, and that was the third step in 1943 when the court jettisoned the non-delegation doctrine. That comes from the very first word of the Constitution. All legislative power herein granted shall be vested in a Congress. So in other words, the power that is herein granted implies that not all power is herein granted. And that's where you get your doctrine of enumerated powers. But then the first word is all legislative powers herein granted shall be vested in a Congress, not in the executive branch agencies, not in the courts, only in the Congress. Well, in 1943, as Congress was creating ever more executive branch agencies and delegating ever more of its power to those agencies because it couldn't possibly micromanage all the details, then we started seeing the agencies doing it. In other words, engaging in regulation, letters in other documents, all of which create a vast body of administrative law, which is where the law that we live under today is mostly created. So how can we return to that? The first thing we can do is reinstate the non-delegation doctrine. And the court today is, in a number of respects, challenging the deference doctrines that have come over the last, or out of the New Deal Supreme Court New Deal constitutional revolution. They are calling these deference doctrines into question, to be sure, only at the edges, but it is a start. But the court cannot do this all by itself. The court cannot overturn Social Security or Medicare or Medicaid or any of the massive entitlement programs that we have today. That will have to come from Congress. But for Congress to do that, that has got to come from the people demanding it. That was one of the exciting things about the Tea Party movement back in 2010 and in the few years after that. You saw these massive demonstrations, and many of the signs that the Tea Party were carrying said, "We want less." Now think of that. When have people come before Congress demanding we want less? But that's what we got to do. Why? Because the Constitution isn't designed only to restrain the officials who govern us. It's designed also to restrain us, the people, so that we cannot, if the Constitution is to be upheld, demand what we have no authority under the Constitution to demand.
Okay. A listener asks, how realistic is a document 245 years old in terms of maintaining relevance today? Couldn't the rise of progressives be attributed to the failure, even today, to correct the original sin of this country, slavery, plus the subsequent less brutal forms of prejudice and a fear of Soviet-style revolution during the Depression? How relevant is the Constitution, and how relevant could it be? Should it be?
Well, the Constitution was written in many or several points with relatively broad language. But let's remember, you can understand the Constitution better if you read the Federalist Papers, which were written as an apologia for the Constitution. And who were they addressed to? Mainly to the anti-federalists, who were concerned that the Constitution gave too much power to this new federal government that was anticipated to be created once it was ratified. So in other words, you had two schools of thought. The Federalists, who were trying to convince the anti-federalists how limited this Constitution really was, and the anti-federalists who wanted it even more limited. You had two schools, the limited government people, the Federalists, and the even more limited government people, the anti-Federalists. There wasn't a socialist in the bunch. Now, to get to the question of whether the New Deal, whether the progressives at the turn of the 20th century and the New Deal people did this because there were pressing reasons to create this ever larger government. Well, there's a way to do that. You have to amend the Constitution. That's the way the Civil War generation did it. They didn't try to ram it through. They passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, which fundamentally changed federalism under as it was contemplated under the original Constitution. There was a great debate during Roosevelt's first term within the administration between those who said, look, we want this new larger government, but we have to do it by constitutional amendment. And those who said, no, all we have to do is put people on the court who will do it simply by rereading the document as it hadn't been read for 150 years. That's the camp that won. And that's why I quoted the Tugwell quote, because they knew exactly what they were doing. They were turning the Constitution on its head. So if you want to do this, and if you have even a minimum respect for the rule of law, which is what stands between us and barbarism, then you have to do it the constitutional way. And if you can't do it that way, then you can't get it. It's that simple. So the argument comes down to whether we're going to respect the rule of law or not. And that's the kind of thing that comes up in these debates in the Senate Judiciary Committee. As when Senator Feinstein asked Neil Gorsuch, Judge Gorsuch, how can we be sure that you will not be for the corporation always and for the little guy? Now, notice what that question entails. It implicates, implicated is the idea that Lady Justice should remove her blindfold to see who is before her. That is the end of the rule of law. Lady Justice is blindfolded because those who come before her are to be treated as equal supplicants before the court. You remove that blindfold and you are on the road toward the end of the rule of law.
We have a question again. We have lots of questions about Congress and the role of Congress in these things. So I'm going to try to put them together. All but about 30 or 40 House seats are considered to be safe, either by gerrymandering or pretty much by gerrymandering. And one of the things that you've indicated that we need is for Congress to retake the reins of its responsibilities under the Constitution to pass laws. So who has an incentive in Congress to aggravate the voters, to do what they're supposed to do? Isn't it easier? This is the first question. Isn't it just easier to do one of these go along, get along things and let the departments make rules and then let the courts solve them rather than taking on their constitutional obligations? That's one. Number two, has COVID made it impossible for these guys to stand up and say, this is how we have to do things? Because the federal government has just co-opted lots and lots of the prerogatives of the medical community, of local governments, of state governments. And third, pointing to this is all together, pointing to the little parent revolt in Virginia, which sparked in the eyes of many people, the election of Governor Youngkin. Does it have to come up? How do we have to tell these people what to do? Is this a case for going down as far as you can get down and getting the people to rise up?
Well, you've actually raised 4 issues there.
Probably 7, but you know.
I know. Well, I'm going to try to answer them in order, but you're going to have to, excuse me, remind me because I'll forget what the questions were. You started with redistricting, which is a thorny political issue. Let's remember, the founders did not contemplate political parties. In fact, Jefferson, especially in Federalist 51, was Federalist 10 rather, was very much concerned with interests and the fact that interests would take over. Well, the interests eventually and soon, in fact, became political parties. And so we've had political parties. And as a practical matter, it's hard to imagine how government can function without political parties. But of course, those parties in their operations must operate within the strictures of the Constitution. Now, the redistricting is a thorny political issue that the court has generally left to the states, which have the primary role in setting forth the rules for voting, although the Congress has a role too to intercede when it feels it's necessary to do so. Thus far, the court has tended not to interfere with redistricting and leaving it to the states, but we get very anomalous situations. We just saw the Alabama situation, but then there are other states we don't hear much about. Maryland, where the Democrats are trying to get rid of the single Republican representative. The same thing is going on in California, in New York, Illinois, and other states. There is no clear, principled answer to the redistricting issue. It is a political issue that the court, understandably and probably rightly, doesn't want to get into except in extreme abuses of it. Second question was what? What you called the first.
The second question was actually a kind of COVID comment. Is it impossible to walk back the executive branch method for doing business after COVID, since it seems to have gotten into all areas of our lives, including areas it never did before, like medical practices?
There was a question before that, after redistricting and before COVID. That was actually your first question. We'll come back to that.
Well, I think that question was whether it's in the interest of congressmen and senators.
Yes, and that's an important. Get along. Yeah, and then I'll go to the COVID. The Congress, it finds it easier to pass broad mom and pop and apple pie legislation, okay, that nobody could disagree with, and then hand it over to the agencies to address all the tough issues that do create divisions between us. Because then it doesn't get the blame, and when it gets constituents complaining, it can then call the bureaucrat before the subcommittee and call the bureaucrat out and play the role of defender of the constituents, even though the bureaucrat is doing the dirty work, as it were, for Congress. And so we've got a system of perverse incentives that work ever more toward this modern regulatory and redistributive state, whereby the rules are made by the bureaucrats who are unelected, unaccountable, and very difficult to fire. So that's the quick answer to a very complex question. Now to get to the COVID. COVID, like war, raises the issue of extraordinary powers that arise in any polity when the polity must come together because there is no way to address these issues through a small common law individualized approach. And you get this when you look at the common law. Common law, you remember earlier on I discussed these two unattractive epistemological schools, skepticism and dogmatism, and how the theory of rights that comes from the Enlightenment and the classical liberal tradition addresses that. There are some things about which people cannot disagree, like the wrongness of murder, rape, and robbery. When you get into other areas, however, such as nuisance, risk, remedies, enforcement, you get into areas where reasonable people can have reasonable differences. How much noise can I make before I violate the rights of my neighbor? How much particulate matter can I waft into the air? Think of environmental regulation. How much risk can I put my neighbor to? If I injure my neighbor, what is the remedy? He'll value it high, his loss. I'll value it low. If I discover that my rights are violated, what due process rights do I have? What due process rights do those I think violated my rights? What does he have, and so forth. These are all areas where reasonable people can have reasonable differences. And so too, when we get into these big issues like war and COVID pandemics and so forth, here we tend to set aside, at least temporarily, our differences and recognize in government extraordinary powers that we hope will retrocede once the once the crisis is over. And that's the state we're in right now with respect to COVID. As we've seen just this week, the states, including Democratic governors, are relaxing their mask requirements, sometimes in schools, sometimes not in schools. And we have places where reasonable people can have reasonable differences, but we're moving in the direction of devolving power ever more from the government back to the people, first at the state level and then at the individual level. Now, what was the last?
So that goes directly to the last question, which was the parent and voter revolt in Virginia. Is that the way to take to enhance that process, to speed up that process, to get people to actually come forward and demand the process?
Yes, absolutely. And it's understandable that these parents are making these demands in this area and other areas as well, as including the curricular issues that I raised earlier on. This is exactly the process that should be taking place. I saw the headline in yesterday's Washington Post. I can't quote it directly, but it said something to the effect that parents are that Youngkin is how did it read? Youngkin is mandating choice for parents.
That's
mandating choice, and the Post was all up in arms about the idea that he is demanding that parents have choice. I mean, isn't that what the country was all about?
One would have thought so.
Would have thought so, yes. I mean, choice is the very essence of individual liberty. Right? That's why we favor free markets, because in free markets, you have a choice. When it's the government, you don't have a choice. If you have a choice of the schools to send your child to, you're in a much freer situation than if you are taxed to the point that you can no longer afford the tuition of a private school because your money is going to the public school that is dictating the curriculum and other things that you may find are offensive to you, and you'd prefer that your children be taught differently.
So this goes to a question from somebody out there. Would you be supportive of Jeremy Bentham's approach to government as, quote, the greatest good for the greatest number, or is that just a way to give more power to the government?
You're talking about the Utilitarian Calculus from Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill Bentham. and modern law and economics folks who use social aggregate social wealth as a criterion for justification. The Constitution was set up such that you have rights first, government second. That is what state of nature theory is all about. You see it in the Declaration, you see it in the preamble to the Constitution. We're born with our rights, our natural rights. We create government to secure those and to flesh out the theory of rights where the rational theory of rights comes to an end, and you have to turn to values to complete the theory. As I said a moment ago, in such areas as nuisance, risk, remedies, and enforcement. Now, when you turn to those, you then invoke utilitarian principles, oftentimes like the greatest good for the greatest number, such as the rational basis, the rational man standard, and so on and so forth. In other words, you are turning to cost-benefit analysis to take environmental considerations. If you don't turn to cost-benefit analysis and you work with a strict do no harm principle, then the super-sensitive plaintiff can shut down the world. The man who comes home from the hospital and is sensitive to noise can stop the church bells from ringing at 6, 12, and 6 down the street. And life as we know it will either end or we'll all have to live in splendid isolation from each other. In fact, I will illustrate this in the issue of the day. What parents who have, sadly, children who are super sensitive because they have some condition want to do is to require all the other students to wear masks to prevent, to protect their super sensitive child. Now you can understand the interest of the parents on both sides of that, but the common law had a principle that addressed that. It said the super-sensitive plaintiff does not get relief, which means that if you're that man who comes home from the hospital, you have to protect yourself in some way. You can't shut down the whole neighborhood simply because you're super-sensitive. And so that is a way in which consequentialist or utilitarian principles work their way into otherwise what are called deontological or rights-based arrangements. But the order of things that is important to keep in mind is that rights come first and the consequentialist things second as a way to flesh out the rights. Because if you do it the other way around, then we could, for example, do medical experiments on unwilling subjects. If we could create some great good from doing so, solve some dreaded disease, we could justify it that way. Indeed, the famous case of Block v. Bell in 1927, decided by the sainted Oliver Wendell Holmes, the great progressive from Cambridge, Massachusetts, was a challenge to a Virginia statute that authorized the, that authorized the sterilization of people who were thought to be of insufficient intelligence, people not as bright as the people on this webinar. And so it came before the Supreme Court. This was all part of the modern eugenics movement. The idea is, how are you going to improve the human species if you allow those people to procreate? The bogus eugenics movement. Well, in an opinion of no more than 5 paragraphs, Oliver Wendell, concluding with the words, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough, homes came down on the side of Virginia, and there followed some 70,000 sterilizations of people in this country. It was finally ended in the 1970s. So that's where you can go if you don't have rights first and consequentialist or utilitarian principles second, but if you work only with utilitarian principles.
So we're coming to the end of our program, and people know that I like to end on an optimistic note. That was not a very optimistic answer, your last one. So
that was 1927, Shoshana.
Well, that's true.
That did end.
It did end. That's all right. There's our optimistic note. But I was going to give you one more opportunity.
Okay, do please.
People have asked, this is really a lot to think about. This is more than you can digest over your sandwich at lunch. And so people have asked for two things. One is, where can they find your writing? You have a website. Tell us what it is. And the other is, where can they find more Madison? More than one person has asked for more Madison.
Oh, okay, good. All right, let's start with Madison. You can do no better than the Federalist Papers. That's Madison, Hamilton, and to a little extent, John Jay. They are just the finest it is the finest treatise in political science that has ever been written. So start with the Federalist Papers. And Madison's essay on property in the National Gazette in 1792 is another one. As for my writings, go to the Cato website, www.cato.org. Go to experts, and you'll find me there. Go to my bio page, and you'll find loads of essays. You might start with a speech that I gave in Rome, in December of 2017. It was the keynote address for a celebration marking the 70th anniversary of the Italian Constitution. And you'll get a lot out of that one. And there are others as well. Another speech I gave in Budapest in 2013, I believe. And then there's lots of things. But again, start with the 4 essays that Shoshana mentioned in inFOCUS. Those are written as magazine articles, and therefore a little lighter than you will find in the more scholarly writings. But to end on a positive note, things seem to be changing with respect to the woke thing. I am as perplexed as I expect much of the audience is over this woke culture. We have seen the cancel culture in so many domains, and we have seen the progressive extremists, especially, taking over the cultural institutions, starting with education and higher education in particular, but also the foundations and even the corporations today. It is striking how politically correct the leadership of our corporations seem they have to be. And of course, I left out the media. The media, starting with National Public Radio, all things considered, is corrupt to the core with respect to these issues. Now, and why we need to have taxpayers supporting National Public, you'd think we wouldn't have news if there were no National Public Radio. You'd think there would be no art if there weren't public subsidies of artists. Did we not have artists before the creation of the National Endowment for the Arts? Did we not have philosophers and scholars before the National Endowment for the Humanities? Why do we need us, all of us, paying for art and philosophy that we find abhorrent? This is absolutely unconscionable and unconstitutional. But finally, as I said, I think we're starting to see a turn. The letter, the man who succeeded me, Ilya Shapiro, who now is sitting, awaiting the decision as to whether Georgetown Law will take him on for a poorly worded tweet he issued in his private capacity a couple of weeks ago. This is an issue that generated a letter from over 200 mostly law professors that you can find through the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, FIRE. You will find it at their website. A letter which includes many liberals who still subscribe to the idea of a constitution for liberty. And so I take this and other indicia, such as the parents protesting at school board meetings, as an indication that we may be turning the corner. But the fundamental issue, as I said some time ago, is that we ourselves must stop demanding ever more goods and services from government, because that has set in motion a set of factual circumstances that cannot end well when we see, as we shove our costs for our current consumption over to our children and grandchildren, it's no accident that today they are having a hard time finding the resources to get their own homes, to plan for their own retirement. We have created those conditions. We have got to slowly reverse them and return to a more responsible way of governing ourselves.
So on that, I think it is sort of positive because it outlines for us what we have to do. But I also like that you think that things are moving in a positive direction. And I'm going to stop there because I'm afraid that we'll wander down some negative path again. And I don't want to go there. So Roger Pilon, thank you for an enlightening, important conversation about rights and responsibilities and also founding documents. And if anybody, really wants to pursue this, go read the Constitution, go read the Declaration of Independence.
In fact, read the Cato Constitution, and you will find there the preface has been written by yours truly, which relates the two documents with respect to their fundamental principles. You can get it very inexpensively at the Cato website, which is not to say that I support everything that is done at the Cato Institute. Let me be clear about that.
I'm not going to ask. Thank you all for tuning in. We will be back with you again soon with another important and interesting and informative speaker. But I want to say, Roger, you have given us an awful lot to think about, and I appreciate it. We all appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
Quite welcome.